Okay, so this is the chapter 7 lecture on race and ethnicity. Hopefully you all can hear me well. uh, this chapter is going to be a little longer than other chapters, specifically because it's important. And so I'm going to take a lot more time explaining and going through some of the material, and especially some supplementary material that may not necessarily be in your textbook. So if you see me looking down here, what you don't see is I have the textbook open to chapter 7. And so if you want to open the textbook and follow along, because I will be referencing some of the tables and figures in chapter 7 as we go through this, it just might help you, follow the material and crystallize your understanding of some of these concepts. So chapter 7, again, broken up into 4 parts. And so the first key issue is, where are ethnicities distributed? But before we even start talking about ethnicity, we need to realize that the concept of race is always involved in ethnicity. Race and ethnicity go hand in hand. Why? Well, we're going to talk about that, but it's important to think about both of these concepts and what they may mean for society overall. So ethnicity, according to the textbook, is identity within a group of people who share, and I bolded share for a reason, share the cultural traditions of a particular homeland or hearth, right? And again, the hearth is just a place of origin for a specific thing, whether that's language, movement, music, right? Whatever, the place that it originated. So ethnicity is how people identify, right? It's identity within a group of people. Now, race is identity with a group of people, not within, with a group of people who are perceived, and I've bolded that on purpose, who are perceived to share a physiological trait such as skin color. So by now, you should have watched the difference between this video. And so we know that race is not supported by science at all. There's no biological evidence to support the concept of race. And so there's only one real race, right? The human race. But race is a social construction. And so let's think about social constructions for a second, right? I think we've talked about this in previous lectures. What is a social construction, right? It's an idea, created and held by a significant number of people in a society, to be true, right? Time, we think we used as an example of a social construction. And so race, right? Different races, because there's no scientific evidence, that is a social construction, right? It's just an idea or made up. But ethnicity is also a social construction, right? But the difference is race is externally assigned to somebody, right? They don't identify as that race. Saying somebody is, black, saying somebody is white, right? That's the external force that's being placed on that person to identify. Whereas ethnicity, if somebody asks you, synonymous with ancestry, what's your ethnicity? You could say, half Polish, half Italian, half Jamaican, whatever, right? But it's you identifying it. That's the difference between ethnicity and race. Ethnicity is your personal self-identification, whereas race is externally assigned to you. So now you might be thinking, how is race externally assigned to somebody? So we talked about ways that social scientists, and in particular geographers, measure and analyze groups of people from their data sources, right? And we have the census and the ACS. But on the census, there's only a set limited number of categories that someone can pick their race, right? And so it's Hispanic or Latino, white, black, African American. And so those types of categories that are already predetermined for somebody to select, right? That's imposing this external force on someone to self-identify within a race that they might not necessarily would do otherwise. And so if you want more information about, the census and how it's really not that user-friendly as far as allowing people to self-identify, feel free to email me and I can send you some supplemental readings on that. However, we also have the concept of nationality, which is also identity with a group of people, but you share legal attachment to a particular country, right? Whether that's, citizenship, for example, or legal permanent residency. Nationality is the identity with a certain group of people within a country, and it may not always be legal attachment, right? Culture plays a huge role, especially now that we're seeing the role of race in 2020 politics. So we've already differentiated between race and ethnicity. I'm not going to spend time on that, but race refers to that physiological trait, right? Somebody's skin color, somebody's physical appearance. And so I want to jump down here real quick to this slide, and hopefully it's legible. But the title is Dehumanizing Science and the Media, plus the media, right? And so on the left here, you can see the depiction of someone from ancient Greece, and then their skull size, and then within their skull size, take note of the brain size. Then Negro, as African Americans and blacks were called, before the civil rights era. Look at the skull shape and size. Look at the brain size compared to Greek, and then on the left is a young chimpanzee, and I'm laughing because it's just so ridiculous. And the skull size is similar, right? And the skull shape is similar to a black person's, but very different from a white Greek's. And then on the right, you have these profiles, right? A side profile of all three of these. And if you can see, they're trying to draw the comparisons physically between a person of color and an orangutan. So I'm going to pause this share now, and I'm going to share a new screen, and the new screen is going to be this link right here, the racist and sexist media. I just wanted to show you guys. So this is from Business Insider, 26 shockingly offensive vintage ads. Most of them are very sexist against women, but there are a few race-based ads. So like Plymouth in the 1940s, take a look at this. Right, they all say Plymouth is the 1940 beauty, but who's driving the car and who's handling the bags? Right, who's the bagman and who's the driver? Some of these are pretty wild. I would suggest you click the link and check these out for yourself. But Van Housen, right? They're known now for making dress shoes. 4 out of 5 men want Oxfords in these new Van Housen styles. Can you guess who doesn't want the new Van Housen style? Yeah, so a lot of these are just pretty bad, and it's shocking now, in today's day and age to imagine that this was the type of media that was commonplace. This colored kids make a costume vastly more attractive. And then the last one is for a soap company, and then this white child's asking the black child, "Why doesn't your mama wash you with fairy soap?" So to possibly imply, right, that this child is dirty. So I'm going to pause this share. I hope you guys were able to see that. If not, please go check it out. I'm not sure if I did the screen pausing correctly, but let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So we talked about the issues with the census, right? But what's the difference between racism and racist? So racism, right? This should be review for you guys. You should be aware of this now, just for common knowledge anyway. But racism is the belief that race is the primary determinant of someone's human traits, right, and capacities, and that racial differences produce this inherent superiority. And then a racist is just simply someone who ascribes to this beliefs, right? So in the early 1950s, throughout the early 1960s, scientists were examining physical differences between white people and black people. So if you look up, 1950s racism science, you can just Google that. There are thousands of studies done on Black people's hands, Black people's feet, Black people's legs, Black people's skull sizes, right? Anything to try to justify this inherent superior difference between races of people. But the scary part is that it was scientists, making these studies and making these claims. And so while a lot of that, should be by now, myths and debunked and phony science, this at the time was used to justify discrimination against people of color. And so when we say people of color, it's referring to usually any individual that's non-white in the U.S. And so when we look at ethnicities in the U.S., and remember, ethnicity is how somebody's self-identifying. My glasses keep slipping, sorry. We have, Hispanic or Latino, and then what does Hispanic mean, right? Typically, Hispanic means someone with ancestry from Spain, and then Latino is somebody who has ancestry from Latin America. African American, 12%, and Asian American, 5%. So we can see that the Hispanic and Latino are actually the second largest group in the US. And again, this is 2015 data, so we can expect these numbers to increase. Let's visualize that, right? Ethnicities in the US. So we said Hispanic and Latino, but within Hispanic and Latino, of course, there are different ethnicities, right? And the three largest in the US being Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban, right? But there are certainly others according to this, even according to this graph. So even other ethnicities from the Caribbean make up almost 10% of the entire Latino diaspora in the United States. And obviously, we would suspect that Mexico would be the largest of those ethnicities in the Hispanic and Latino diaspora simply due to distance, right? Mexico borders the U.S. and these migrants and people moving, from Mexico don't have to travel far as compared to someone coming from Asia. Now, if we look on the right, we can see the same kind of deal, but for the Asian group. And so the Chinese comprise most U.S. immigrants, but let's think about this for a second, right? We talked previously about immigration policy and how it's impacted different Asian groups unequally. And so it makes sense that people from China are the majority of Asian American immigrants, but also, just regular Americans in general with Asian ancestry, because the Chinese have the longest history of immigration to the United States. Remember, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, because all of the railroad workers during that time were Chinese and Irish, and so there was this, white uprising saying that the Chinese were taking jobs, and so the act was passed. And then, as the economy picked up, the United States targeted, Japan for their labor, their cheap labor, and then the same deal happened. Immigration laws were passed, and then again the Philippines. But India is 17.5, and that is actually the product of the 1990 Act that we covered, right? And so India, 17.5%, that's mostly a direct reflection of the increase in H-1B visas, or skilled workers in the high-tech sector. So again, we know what distributions are by now, right? We should. This is post-exam 1, so hopefully you got that question right. Let's look at the distribution by county of, percent Hispanic or Latino. And we should see again that because of the distance close, not only to Mexico, right, but to the Caribbean and general Latin America, we can see that the southern U.S. comprises, and the West, comprises of the most Hispanic or Latino distributions. And so all of these counties, especially if we take it down toward the home level of Texas, this shouldn't be surprising to anyone, right? Because the Mexican border is right here. I'm not going to go through all of these ethnicities. You can take a look at some of these maps. They're pretty cool. But I do want to talk about key issue 2, and that's why do ethnicities have distinct distributions? So the maps above, they illustrate where they are, but why is that the case? Yes, international migration plays a role, and we talked about the 2 types of international migration, right? Voluntary and forced. So because most African Americans are descended from Africans that were forced and kidnapped from Africa and taken as slaves to the not only the United States, also South America and Central America. And so when we take a look at the map, it's not really a map, it's a figure 2.2, right? I'm on page 241 in the text. I'm probably going to do the text thing from now on just because it's just another way and that we can all follow along and be on the same page as we're going through the material. But we can see the purple arrows on 2.2 indicate the slave trade routes, right? So the origins or the hearth of slavery is the west coast of Africa. Now, again, the United States were more familiar with the history of slavery in the U.S., but that's not the only place that African slaves were kidnapped and brought to, right? We have Cuba, Mexico, and South America. And then the colors of the continents which slaves were brought to is, the colonizing force that kidnapped the slaves. And then on the right side, we can see this kind of, three-legged triangle of production and what the products of slavery were, right? And so we can see here that, we have the kidnapping routes of slavery, even descending all the way as low as Argentina, and then going up through pretty much like sugar plantations, right? And then exporting rum to the UK and this kind of and raw materials, right? And then the UK kind of processing it and then selling it back in West Africa. So, as you should be familiar with American slavery, but if you're not, there were unimaginable atrocities, right? Separating families, destroying villages, packing people onto ships with extremely high density. And again, right, density being one of our key concepts in this course. Kept in change, minimal food scraps. 1 in 4 kidnapped slaves died on the journey here to the U.S. So the 13 colonies that formed the U.S. had large plantations, and plantation labor, right? Plantation, the whole concept of plantations runs on cheap labor, and labor is needed for any kind of plantation to survive, especially agricultural labor. So the two main cash crops at that time were cotton and tobacco. And so nearly all Africans shipped to these 13 colonies ended up, in the southeast United States. Right? When we talk about distribution, it's not by coincidence. Right? We always have to think about the social, political, and economic processes. This one being the economic processes that were behind the scenes, which contributed to, these settlement patterns of American slaves in the U.S. And so slavery lasted until the 13th Amendment or 1865. Now, that being said, we can't be, you can't, I can't, nobody can. We can't be one of these people that says, okay, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, so what's the big deal? Slavery's over. Why is it so hard for Black Americans now? And that's insanely ignorant, because it neglects a lot of the history and actual laws that have been enacted by the U.S. government to restrict Black people's access to resources, including housing, food, jobs, right? And so what am I talking about? I'm not just going to say it, I'm going to back it up. So there was something called the Black Codes. So post-emancipation, right? Post end of physical slavery, these Black Codes were restrictive laws, again, laws, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with the process, I hope, of, what it takes for something to become a law, right? Drafts of bills, majority approval, things like that. So they were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery was abolished. How does that happen? So yeah, although 4 million slaves were freed post, 13th Amendment, the status in the South was much, much different than it was in the North. So under these black codes, many states required that, previous slaves sign yearly labor contracts to keep working on the same plantations that they were supposedly freed from. And if they refused, they were risk being arrested, fined, or forced into the unpaid labor. So pretty much forced back into slavery. So these southern states said, okay, here's a labor contract. We'll pay you, barely anything. If you don't want to do it, we can either fine you or arrest you. Or if you're that adamant about, not doing it, then we have ways of forcing you back into unpaid labor. And so that seems pretty counterproductive to the 13th Amendment, right? And so the black codes were the underwriting, right, of sharecropping. And what is sharecropping? Right? It's working on land the same way slaves worked land for nothing. And now sharecroppers got, 10 to 20% of those profits in addition to some of the food. But as post-slavery in the U.S. continued, the physical form, some of the bigger northeastern cities, became industrialized as the Industrial Revolution is happening now. And so there are a lot of blacks in the South moving out of the South, right? Inter-regional migration to industrial cities for the opportunity, economic opportunity, right? For better jobs, for not having to be in the Southern, political and social climates. And so as African Americans are moving from the South into Northeast cities, there's also population changes, in some of these industrial cities. And so even without looking at this, if you haven't been to Detroit, what is your perception of Detroit? I guarantee you the first thing that comes to your mind is not something positive about Detroit, right? You either think Detroit is the hood, you either think Detroit is, high crime, right? And that's not by chance. That is the information that's been out there, that's been, forced upon you. It's up to you to determine if that's true, and it's up to you to fact check that with other information. We can't just rely on one or two media sources to hopefully give us accurate information. And while that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself, do realize that journalists in the newspapers and journalists on TV are held to higher responsibility and accountability standards than information published on social media, right? There are a code of ethics that journalists in professional fields outside of social media abide by, and anything posted on social media is not regulated by by the government or anything else. There's no regulations, and when I say regulations, I'm talking about there's nothing to prevent false information from being widely spread, right? The anti-vax thing being one of them, right? The misinformation that goes out there but also circulates quickly. Companies like Facebook, companies like Twitter, they're not held responsible through the law for any of that information that's being disseminated to be accurate or fact checked. But that's not the case on news stations and newspapers. So always keep that in mind, because the accountability and the responsibility of certain news agencies versus social media to prevent things that are factual, it's entirely different. And so while they say you can't believe everything you read, especially you cannot believe everything you read on social media. Now, let's get back to this figure 2.2, population change in Detroit. So as African Americans are leaving the South for economic opportunity in industrial cities in the North, we can see that white people are leaving the area, right? And it's not by design. This is actually the consequence of social processes, culture, right? White people not wanting to associate with African Americans for several reasons, right? And within those several reasons, we can think, politically, economically, socially, physically, right? But it's not by design, or no, sorry, it's not by chance that we have segregated cities in the United States. It's not by chance that wealthy people live in an area and low-income people live in another area, right? And so how does that happen? How do those distributions occur? Well, institutions are largely responsible for creating these types of outcomes and policies. So there's something called block busting. And if you don't know what block busting is, it's pretty much during the time of the Industrial Revolution and way through even the 1950s, as more and more African Americans were moving to the South, to the North, for economic opportunity, more social inequality. I shouldn't say equality because that still doesn't exist, but at least more social inequality than the Southern climate. Real estate agents convinced white homeowners to sell their homes for low prices because they said, hey, African Americans are moving into the neighborhood. And so if you don't sell now, your neighborhood is going to become crime ridden. Your housing values are going to rapidly decline. And so you should get out while you can. And so in turn, what those agents did was they got white people to sell their houses cheap. And then they turned around and sold those same houses at much higher prices to incoming black families. This is known as steering, right? Steering people towards a certain neighborhood. And so what's the outcome? Well, first, a blockbuster, right? Not the movie, was the first black family to move into an all-white neighborhood. So once block busting occurred, that's when we saw these real estate agents go to work, and the result was panic selling. But there's also more that state governments and federal governments are doing to restrict where African Americans can move and where they can live. So this one is more popular than blockbusting, and it's called redlining. And that's refusing to give somebody a loan or insurance because they live in an area deemed, too high of a financial risk. So, African Americans and Hispanic neighborhoods have been redlined as a part of this systematic racism. So what does that mean? Okay. Let's take a look at this. So this is from Evans Bank Trade, right? This is a real map. And you're looking at like a neighborhood on Lake Erie. And so the blue with the slashes through it are neighborhoods that are above 50% African American, and then the ones with the horizontal lines are above 40%. And so all of these areas outside of these African American communities, those are okay, right? Those have been assessed by banks to not be as risky. But these areas inside, way too risky, right? And it just so happens that they happen to be predominantly African Americans living in these neighborhoods. This is not a coincidence. And so when people say, oh, slavery's over, people say, what's the big deal? I don't understand why minorities can't bootstrap. Because there's an entire system behind that that's designed to prevent them from not only equality, but access to resources as well. And if you don't understand this, I mean, we're just skimming the surface here on what, government policies have done to restrict, minorities' access to resources in general. But if you don't understand that, and not only understand it, but acknowledge that that's a real problem because it's a system designed against minorities, then there's no hope of fixing that type of system. If you don't understand it, how can you fix it? But number one, you have to accept this, that it's a fact, because this is a figure, right? I'm showing you an actual map from Evans Bank. This is implemented in practice. This is empirical evidence. This is not just suggesting that this happened. This actually happened. So all of us, U.S. society, we can't ignore these types of histories because there's no way to provide solutions to it if we're not understanding the root cause of the problem. And so the result is let's see, page 243, the expansion of these areas that were deemed too risky for investment, right? So the redlined areas, because there was no, money going, whether it's, investment in development or personal loans for mortgages or, whatever, right? We have African American cities and neighborhoods that have continuously grown in poverty because of this, right? So as all populations increase in the United States, so do minority populations. And so when you're forcing a specific group of people to live in an area and forcing, limiting their choices on what schools they have to go to and what, neighborhoods they can live in. And not only what schools they go to, but what, school districts they're allowed to go in. It becomes extremely problematic nationwide. And so we see in 1940, right, Baltimore, only certain neighborhoods were above 90% African American. How about down here on figure B in the 70s? That 90% is growing. And let's look at 2010. These are the direct results of laws and policies. Just as we saw in the 1965 Act, which allowed a ton of immigration from around the world to the United States because it eliminated that quota system. And so, the US really wasn't that diverse until post 1965. And so if you can take that and say, okay, I understand that this is a law that enabled the diversity and ethnicity in the United States to occur, then there's no difference. There should be no difference in your mind acknowledging that these same policies have disproportionately impacted people of color in the United States. So the idea, right, the separate but equal, this was a thing. Plessy versus Ferguson. Supreme Court decides in Louisiana, the case revolved around a Louisiana train separating, cars on the train. It was constitutional because it provided separate but equal treatment of blacks and whites. And equality did not mean that whites had to mix socially with blacks. So think about that. The argument is, yeah, separation on train cars is fine because it's a train and we're all going to the same place. And so while the level of service is equal, that doesn't mean that socially black people have to interact with white people. So while that was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1896, post decision of that, Southern states enacted a comprehensive set of laws to separate black people from white people as much as they could, known as Jim Crow. So Plessy versus Ferguson, again, a Supreme Court decision, set the groundwork for Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is just, again, a series of restrictive policies aimed to govern how minorities, and in particular African Americans in society, right, are not only treated, but where they can go to school, where they can live, right? And this is all the result of policy. It's insane to think about that, right? It's almost unfathomable because you would ask, how could government officials get away with that? But, given the current situation that all of America is facing, it's really not that hard to figure out how that's happening, right? Again, we've all seen this photo of the water fountains, right? But segregation by race, this didn't only occur in the United States, right? We have South African apartheid, which is a whole different subject in itself. But again, this occurred in different areas around the world. So what was the response of African Americans in particular to these institutional mechanisms designed to restrict their access and movement? One of them was called the Green Book, not the movie. The movie does a terrible job, in my opinion, depicting what the Green Book actually did and was. And so the Green Book was written by a New York postal employee, an African-American postal worker, and it was a guide intended to help middle-class African Americans travel across the United States and to avoid discrimination. And so this book had, establishments by state and city and street address that were African American friendly. So this book says, go to whatever Green's Lodge on I-85. It's African American friendly, and et cetera, et cetera. And it avoids the establishments that are not, African American friendly during this time. Now, keep in mind the times that this is published in: 1936 to the Civil Rights Movement. Right, and so this was updated yearly. Every year, the title was the Negro Motorist Green Book. It would come out yearly with new and updated establishments. Say, for example, one of the establishments turned out to not be friendly to African Americans. That would be updated in the next version, right? And so this is just a photo of what the actual Green Book looked like, with street addresses and institutions. We have taverns, hotels, tourist homes, taxi cabs, right? Then we come to another Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Ed. So now the Supreme Court, again, this is the Supreme Court of the United States of America, deciding that separate schools for blacks and whites was unconstitutional, because no matter how equal the facilities were, right, no matter how many drinking fountains they had or classrooms they had, racial separation branded minority children as inferior. So the whole concept of separate but equal is completely contradictory to itself, right? If it's separate but equal, then what is the difference, right? There really is no difference. Just as, people today, in my opinion, supporting the blatant lies that, President Trump says, and defending him, regardless of, the truthfulness to those statements. And so again, these are just, the upcoming figures are just illustrations of the impacts that certain laws like redlining and blockbusting have had on neighborhoods. And now let's move to key issue 3. Why might ethnicities face conflict? And again, this is a few years old, this material, it couldn't be more relevant than ever. So nationalism, according to your textbook, is a group of people who share legal attachment and personal allegiance to a specific country. Let's think about this. And, I illustrated this with a guy who had 100% American tattooed and an American flag barcode, on the back of his neck. So nationalism is the feeling of oneness in the minds of people of a particular country, regardless of their language, cultural aspects, or religious aspects. Let's think about that for a second. So nationalism, the definition of nationalism says, regardless of your culture, we're all citizens of the same country. And so we're happy, we're proud to be citizens of the same country. Nationalism today, especially in 2020, is being used as a scapegoat to create racial polarization. Because it's not saying, all of us are in this together, all of us are part of a nation. It's saying, black people are different than white people, Hispanics are different than blacks, Hispanics are different than Asians, Asians are different than whites. And so that guise, right, that guise of nationalism, especially under the right wing right now, as we're seeing in, the multitude of militias, white militias in particular. There are black militias, but there's certainly more white militias that are using the guise of nationalism to polarize, people of that same oneness more. And so you wonder why, or how does that happen? And so nationalism is different than culture, right? It's not saying that we share the same culture, so, we're all in this together. It can be seen as emphasizing heritage, which is, the argument that some people make for keeping the Confederate flag and, statues of people that have previously been slave owners. But the nation is placed at the center of all the concerns, right? And, make America great again. That's a whole slogan in and of itself that places nationalism at the center of that slogan. And so it can include, you know, your preferred aspiration for democracy, although I would argue, right, that the militia groups and the majority of people that are using nationalism as a guise to promote that racial division and polarization, they're not really upholding the values of democracy, right? It's just Trump, really. And I'm not saying that I'm a Democrat or Republican, right? But I'm saying what my observations have been. If nationalists truly upheld, you know, the governance and principles of democracy, then, and being nationalists, they should be outraged that there's been foreign interference in our elections, not just because it's may have served their purpose and that their preferred candidate might have won or their preferred policies have been the outcome of neglecting the democratic process overall, right? That's completely contradictory. That's not being a nationalist, and that's certainly not upholding the principles of a democracy, claiming to be a nationalist, right? That's something else. And so cultural nationalism occurs when a nation is defined by a shared culture and its characteristics. So is the United States this cultural nationalism? I would heavily argue no. And again, I'm only using Trump here and his administration as examples of what we've seen socially, right, in the United States, especially over the last year, right? The more racial polarization in particular, but the same people that are willing, to go out and protest and open carry their weapons and say that they're nationalists. And I'm not, all different cultures and all different ethnicities do this, right? I'm not just, harping on the right wing, typically white nationalists in particular, but they are the overwhelming majority of people claiming to be nationalists. And if they understood or if they respected what a nationalist was, then they would realize that behavior is completely their behavior is completely contradictory to putting the nation first, because it's undermining the democratic process. And so their agenda seems to revolve around the outcome more than the democratic process itself. Again, this is my opinion, but this is how I've interpreted the past events of this year and what I've seen in the news. And if you disagree, hey, that's what the threads are for, right? We're all free to voice our opinions here. There's no judgment. So if you don't agree with what I'm saying, please seriously take to the threads and we can have a civil discussion about it. I'm looking forward to that. That's what I'm hoping for, right? Because the more and more we discuss, the more and more we reflect on our own perceptions, and the more and more we critically think about things and actually learn. And so lastly, what I'm going to talk about is, why does ethnic cleansing happen? So imagine this level of polarization, right? To the point where it's widespread violence now. So you have examples from the text that have forced migrations in Europe, the Bosnia genocide, and the ethnic cleansings and genocides in Africa. So just as we saw forced migration, not here is not in the form of kidnapped slavery, but forced migration due to safety, right? And again, how do we characterize, and when I say we, I mean in particular the U.S. government, right? How does the U.S. government in particular categorize people that are moving for forced migrations? If we remember, right, there's internally displaced persons, which don't cross an international border, refugees, which do cross an international border, and asylum seekers that want to be recognized as a refugee. And so again, all three fleeing for safety. So I don't want to get too into the maps, because we're already, this one's already taken a lot of time, but ethnic cleansing, what is that? A purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnicity, or religious group from certain geographic areas. So what does that mean? It means that, number one, it's a policy designed to legally create violence against another group of people, but also having the means to do that, right? It's not just saying like, hey, we want to kill X people from X group. It's saying we want to do this, and we can. We have the power to. So what does that process look like? Move a large amount of military equipment and personnel into, an area that has no strategic value. Right, strategic value, if we're not familiar with that kind of concept, it's pretty much an area of land that has value, like economic or political value, right? We can think of, oil fields as having political and economic value. We can think of ports as having strategic location for, military value. But typically with ethnic cleansing, then you round up all the people in that area that you've now moved the military equipment and personnel to, segregate people by sex, and then place usually men in detention camps or kill them. This is starting to sound pretty familiar from examples that you should have learned in US history. And then force the rest of the people to either leave the area that you've recently put all of your military equipment and personnel in, or pretty much march them outside of a territory to be killed. And so this happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so let's look at 1991, the predominant ethnicity in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time. It seems to be a toss-up between majority Serb and Croatian. And then let's look at 1998. What do you see? I see a lot more segregation and clear patterns of ethnicities in 1998, right? Again, not by design. People, especially people, large groups of people that belong to the same culture, their settlements are not by design. They're not there by chance, especially in the developed world. On top of that, right? It's policies and laws that shape all of those 5 spatial components, right? If we want to think about the impacts of the 1965 law, socially, more diversity. Economically, more skilled workers and more labor. Right? Politically, better relations with other countries because now immigrants are coming from all over the U.S. and that's become permitted by the law itself. Right? So always be thinking in these 5 spatial components, but also remember that anytime we see a large group of people acting in a certain way, or a large group of people, restricted or living in a certain area, that's always the result of policy. Some type of policy. So as I just said really very quickly before, it's not ethnic genocide or ethnic cleansing wasn't just because a certain group wanted it to happen. They had the means for it to happen, right? And so the Rwandan genocide, we've all heard of that. It was a 2-group genocide, involving 2 groups. The Hutus, which were settled farmers that grew crops in the fertile hills of both countries, and then the Tutsis were settled cattle herders who migrated to present-day Rwanda and Burundi from the Rift Valley. So the Tutsis are the new group in this area, right? But both groups speak the same language, hold similar beliefs, and practice similar social customs. And intermarriage between these 2 groups has lessened the physical differences between them. But relations between these settled farmers and herders is uneasy. And this is actually the same cause of genocide that we see in Darfur. If you don't know what Darfur is, please Google it. But that should be Hutsis. The Hutsis were the majority of the population, right? So again, the Hutus were the majority of the population, and they were settled farmers. But the Tutsis, the newcomers, controlled the kingdoms for several hundred years and turned the Hutus into their serfs, which a serf is just an agricultural laborer pretty much bound by this hierarchical system to, you know, do agricultural work. And so while Tutsis were the minority, they held the power. And so again, when we think about policy, we think about politics, it's always synonymous with power. Now, an important thing to note relating it back to the US context here is that the United States is becoming a minority-majority country. So in the next 2 decades, white people are not going to be the majority group anymore, right? And so that is a really big problem for white people in particular. Not all white people, obviously, but should I say the nationalist white people that want to hold on to this power, right? And are doing everything they can through policy and government to retain that power. And we probably see this, best reflected in voting rights and voting polling place closures and district boundaries that are drawn to limit where and when and how people can vote, right? And so even the electoral college itself, and I'm only elaborating on politics now because the next chapter that we're going to deal with is political geography, and I'm going to talk more about this. But even people's votes, individual votes, especially for president, they're overridden by the electoral college, and I'll talk about that later on. But we have this idea in the U.S., and I say we Americans have this idea that elections are this open resource that anybody can just go and participate, regardless of skin color, ethnicity, background, whatever. And that is not the case. So by restricting that system, which ultimately doesn't even decide who the president is, when we're talking about not only corruption but power, this is more evident than ever. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, but hopefully the screen share when I was going through some of those racist and sexist ads worked. If it didn't, the hyperlink is right in the PowerPoint for you guys to go check out. I hope this was helpful as far as providing more context to Chapter 7, because Chapter 7 doesn't do the greatest job talking about race, and especially doesn't do the greatest job elaborating on a lot of the policies that have influenced the distribution of settlement patterns that we see in the textbook. So while you're only seeing the product of policies in the text, I also always want to give you the power relations that create these outcomes. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully it was enlightening and you learned something. And please take to the threads to have a discussion about this.